I'm deaf. I'm profoundly deaf.
I'm happy to be deaf. My parents didn't know I was deaf until I was 18 months old. My parents' world crashed in on them because hearing society views deafness as a negative. My doctor told my parents, don't learn sign because it would make me isolated. I wouldn't fit in with the hearing society. I needed to learn to speak, to read lips, so I could fit in with the hearing world. So I grew up as an oral deaf person, learning to speak and read lips, and I faced a lot of challenges. Challenges fitting in. What was my identity? Missing out on a lot. My first word was boat. My parents were driving in the car across a bridge and I saw a boat and I screamed out the word boat. And that's why I guess today my 29-foot boat is in my parking lot. Our focus was on reading lips growing up. And I spent a lot of time focused on learning about the history, English, math that courses offered. And deaf children did the same as I did at that time. My parents realized today that the doctor didn't understand the critical part of language development for deaf children is to have a strong foundation for learning, using sign language as their first initial language, and learn to read lips later. Today, I'm 53 years old. I know who I am. I'm proud to be deaf. I value my deaf identity, my sign language, my culture and its history. Today I know that we as deaf people can do anything. We're not disabled. We can be successful doctors, attorneys, engineers, college professors, actors, athletes, scientists even, and many more. We even have a White House receptionist who's deaf today. When I talk about deaf culture, it's important for everyone to realize our way of life. It has a long history. Just like every other ethnic group has their own values, their culture, their language. Same with the deaf community. Let me give you some examples of our normative culture. We tend to be very blunt. For example, we'll come up to someone and say, oh, you've gained weight, wow. Or those clothes are wrong for you. Your haircut, you should have done this or that. Very blunt, very honest. Whereas the hearing culture tends to be a little less so. Oh, well, you know, your hair doesn't look quite right. So we really are very detailed, explaining everything in great detail. For example, if someone dies, we ask a lot of questions. How did they die? Where? Whereas the hearing culture will say, oh, I'm sorry for your loss. Another example is hearing students who come into my sign language classroom when I'm teaching will say, oh, sorry I'm late. If a deaf student comes into my class, they'll say, oh, I'm so sorry I'm late. I was behind this huge truck and it had eggs and it fell over in the middle of the highway and blocked the road and the police and emergency vehicles came, and they'll go on and on and on for 2 or 3 minutes explaining why they were late. And finally, you know, they'll say, so sorry I'm late. But that's cultural. We tend to have a 5-stage goodbye process. For example, if we're in a restaurant as a group, we're all sitting at a big table, the manager comes to let us know we're getting ready to close the restaurant. Well, we want to continue our conversation, and we will for 5 or 10, 15 more minutes, and then we'll stand up, still chatting for another 5 minutes or so. The group will move away from the table, and for another 10 minutes, 15 minutes, finally we've gotten near the door, which is the 3rd stage of the goodbye. We're still talking furiously for another 10 minutes, and then we're out in the parking lot. And we're talking and talking and talking. Conversations are continuing till about the 5th stage. We're in our cars, but we are still chatting with each other. Finally, we all leave. It's probably a 1 or 2 hour process. Whereas hearing people who come to a party or an event say, bye, I'm out of here, and they're gone. 5 minutes max. It's a cultural difference that we have. Let me explain a little bit more about sign language itself. Sign language has been here for thousands of years. It's nothing new. Let me give you some history from way back. About 427 BC, the Greek philosopher Plato wrote in his Catalyst, Socrates had a quote saying, "If we had no tongue or voice, but we wanted to express our thoughts, our feelings, we could use those deaf people's manner, how they use their body language and hands and facial expression and head to convey. We could do it like them." And that's the earliest documented use of sign language that far ago. Moving into the 1700s, in Martha's Vineyard, there was a very large deaf population on the island that lived there. It was 1 in 25 people were deaf. Almost everyone signed, hearing and deaf both, who lived on the island. Everyone signed. And they had deaf business owners. The community in the town meetings, all the events, everyone signed and spoke. There were no communication barriers. There was no linguistic challenge, no frustration in communication at all. Very open. Now in 1814, the American School for the Deaf was first established. It was the first formal deaf education. And that's when a large group of deaf individuals relocated from Martha's Vineyard to Hartford. Very successful education provided for their deaf children in their own language. And many who graduated the American School for the Deaf went to found schools for the deaf in other states nationwide and became successful there. And many of them went on to move to Gallaudet University when it was established in 1864 for a college education and a degree. And that was the best and most glorious time for deaf culture. Deaf education was available, the community flourished. And about 70 years later, in 1880, that was the year that we will never forget. It was really the worst time in deaf history. It was the darkest hour, and that impacted the entire world from that year on. Delegates from throughout the world convened in Milan, Italy, for the Second International Congress on Deaf Education. They voted there and forbade sign language as a method for teaching deaf children, and instead, deaf children had to learn to speak. And that impacted schools for the deaf in America. They fired all the deaf education teachers because they couldn't speak. They replaced them all with hearing teachers who taught the deaf children how to speak and lip read. And that began the language deprivation, the cultural deprivation, the deaf identity being ripped away from us. And that cultural experience became one of discrimination and oppression. And those were the darkest times for the many years later, for the next 60 years, until finally, at Gallaudet University, an English professor noticed on campus, the deaf students who were signing had very similar signing styles. Dr. William Stokey was a researcher, and he studied and researched and found that American Sign Language is a true language with its own grammar, its own syntax, morphemes, mouth movements. The 5 parameters of American Sign Language were identified: hand placement, movement, and hand shape, facial expressions, and all of those were documented. That American Sign Language was not gestural. We were not copying English. It was its own true language. And that began the deaf world coming back to where they should have been as a true language, developing a language, and the identity for the community was back. That time period, from then on, many children who had deaf parents, who are called codas, they grew up within the deaf community as hearing children born to deaf parents using sign language as their first language. That generation took on the responsibility of being our first interpreters for the deaf world and the hearing world to communicate between each other. And looking back at Martha's Vineyard, they didn't need interpreters. Everyone communicated fluidly because everyone signed. Now, from the 60s on, the codas were able to communicate for us within the deaf and hearing world. And those codas took on more and more responsibility. But the demand for interpreters grew. And colleges all over the US established their own interpreter training programs within about the 1970s. And over the years, the profession of interpreting raised the bar. They went through years of training as interpreters, but it's not something you can learn in a 4-year program. You have to have a deep understanding of culture and language, which is only gotten from our deaf community. Now, the new movement today in interpreting is that today deaf interpreters are being developed, whereas hearing interpreters are paired with deaf interpreters in their world, hearing interpreters in theirs. And with the natural language that deaf interpreters bring to the process, they support hearing interpreters who will interpret into English. And it's a movement we're seeing more and more deaf interpreters, DIs, popping up nationwide. Now the question is that we have to ask ourselves, and have many times over the last few years, suppose the year 1880 never happened. All those schools still had deaf instructors teaching deaf children. Would there be so many deaf business owners who had flourished over the years? The hearing and the deaf worlds wouldn't be separate. They would be combined like they were on Martha's Vineyard. We would have no need for interpreters because you would all be signing. That's the question that we have to ask ourselves over the years. Thank you.